Good morning, Colonel. The judge's voice cut through the courtroom so sharply that even the ceiling fans seemed to stop spinning. For a second, nobody moved. Not the clerk. Not the lawyers. Not my daughter sitting 3 rows behind me with tears already forming in her eyes. And definitely not my mother-in-law, Evelyn Carter. She had been smiling only moments earlier, that polished country club smile she wore whenever she thought she'd already won. But the instant the judge called me Colonel, that smile cracked. Her face turned pale beneath layers of expensive makeup, and she stared at me like she was seeing a stranger sitting at the defense table. "Wait," she whispered, then louder. "What?" I kept my hands folded calmly on the table. After 20 years in military courtrooms, I'd learned something important. The loudest person in the room usually had the weakest case, and Evelyn Carter had been loud for years. 3 months earlier, I was standing in my kitchen making chicken soup when the certified letter arrived. It was raining that afternoon in Norfolk, Virginia. The kind of cold spring rain that settles into your bones when you're over 60. I remember because my knees were aching worse than usual. The envelope had the return address of Carter and Bellamy Legal Group. I already knew it couldn't be good. After my husband Frank passed away the previous winter, every interaction with his family had turned into some kind of quiet battle. At first it was small things. Evelyn criticizing the funeral flowers I chose, complaining that I sold Frank's fishing boat too quickly, telling relatives I was acting emotional whenever I disagreed with her. But after a while the politeness disappeared. Money has a way of stripping the paint off people. Especially old money. I opened the letter slowly at the kitchen counter while the soup simmered behind me. The words blurred together at first. Petition for estate review. Allegation of undue influence. Property dispute. I had to sit down. Frank's lake house. That's what this was really about. Not grief. Not family. Not love. The lake house. It sat on a quiet stretch of Smith Mountain Lake where Frank and I had spent almost every summer for 32 years. It wasn't some mansion. Just an old cedar cabin with creaky floors, faded green shutters, and a dock Frank rebuilt twice with his own hands. But it was the one place my husband had truly been happy, especially near the end. Cancer changes a man. Toward the end of Frank's illness, the lake house became the only place he could sleep peacefully. He'd sit on the dock wrapped in an old navy blanket while I read beside him. Sometimes we wouldn't talk for an hour. We didn't need to. Now Evelyn wanted it. And according to the lawsuit, she intended to prove I manipulated her dying son into leaving it to me. I laughed when I finished reading. Not because it was funny. Because after 62 years on this earth, sometimes betrayal becomes so predictable it almost loses its power to shock you. Almost. People often assume quiet women are weak. I learned that long ago. Especially women my age, you become invisible in America after a certain point. Cashiers stop making eye contact. Doctors interrupt you. Young professionals call you sweetheart while explaining things you already understand better than they do. I didn't mind invisibility most days. After retirement, I preferred it. But Evelyn mistook silence for helplessness. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake was believing she knew me. "You should just settle my daughter Anna," told me that evening. We sat at my kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows. Anna looked exhausted. Divorced 2 teenagers, hospital billing job. Life had worn her down lately. "I don't want you going through stress like this," she said quietly. "Grandma Evelyn has money, lawyers, connections." I stirred my tea slowly. "I know. She says the house belongs in the Carter family." I looked up. I was Frank's family. Anna's eyes softened immediately. "I know, Mom." But she still sounded afraid. Truthfully, I understood why. Most people had no idea what I used to do before retirement. Even my own daughter knew only pieces. Frank and I had agreed long ago to keep my military career private outside close circles. Not secret exactly. Just separate. After years of military tribunals, overseas investigations, and enough human ugliness to last several lifetimes, I wanted peace. I wanted gardens.
Books.
Coffee on the porch. I wanted to become ordinary again. And for a while I succeeded. At least until Evelyn Carter dragged me into court. A week later, Evelyn invited the family to Sunday dinner. That alone told me she was planning something. Evelyn never hosted unless there was an audience. Her home overlooked the Elizabeth River all-white columns and polished silverware, the kind of house where nobody ever really relaxes. The moment I walked in, I could feel it. The performance had already started. Frank's younger brother Richard barely looked at me. His wife Sandra offered me one of those tight little smiles wealthy people use when they're pretending to behave morally. Dinner dragged on through passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. "You must be overwhelmed financially now," Evelyn said while cutting her roast. "I'm managing. Well, legal matters can become expensive." I sipped my water calmly. Across the table, Richard smirked. "You know, he said Dad always intended that property to stay in the Carter bloodline." I looked directly at him. "Frank made his wishes very clear." Evelyn dabbed her lips with a napkin. "That's what your lawyers claim." "My lawyers." Interesting choice of words, because at that point I hadn't hired any. I realized then that they truly believed I'd panic, that I'd sell quietly, disappear quietly, lose quietly. Evelyn leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You know what your problem is, Margaret?" I waited. "You always acted like you were smarter than everyone else." Sandra shifted uncomfortably. Anna stared at her plate. But Evelyn continued. "You were just a housewife at the end of the day." The room went silent. And strangely enough, that hurt more than the lawsuit. Not because of pride. Because Frank had known exactly who I was. He respected the years I'd given to service. The sacrifices. The nightmares. The things I still carried quietly. And now he was gone. I set my fork down carefully. "I'll see you in court, Evelyn." She smiled. "Oh, Margaret." Then she laughed softly. "You're finished." That night I sat alone on my porch listening to distant thunder over the water. I thought about Frank. About the oath I took decades ago. About all the young soldiers I'd once prosecuted, and the innocent ones I defended. I had spent 20 years serving military law. 20 years learning that truth matters less than preparation. And Evelyn Carter had no idea who she'd decided to humiliate. For the first time in months, I opened the old leather case in my closet. Inside rested my military records, my commission papers, and the Silver Eagle insignia I hadn't touched since retirement. I held it in my palm for a very long time. Then I smiled quietly to myself. Not from anger, not revenge, just certainty. Because for the first time since Frank died, I finally remembered exactly who I was. The morning of the hearing, I woke before sunrise. That used to happen before every major tribunal overseas. No alarm clock needed. Just the body remembering pressure before the mind fully catches up. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark with a cup of black coffee warming my hands. Outside, Norfolk was still quiet. Streetlights reflected off damp pavement from the night rain. At 62 years old, silence feels different than it did when you're young. When you're young, silence feels empty. When you're older, it feels earned. I stared at the folder sitting beside my coffee mug. Plain brown leather, no expensive briefcase, no dramatic stacks of paperwork. Just enough. That was another thing military law taught me. The people most desperate to appear powerful usually carried the biggest binders. I dressed simply that morning. Gray slacks, navy blouse, dark wool coat. Nothing flashy, nothing that invited attention. I tied my silver hair back neatly and looked at myself in the hallway mirror before leaving. A widow, a grandmother, a woman most people would overlook in a grocery store. Perfect. The courthouse downtown stood exactly the way old American courthouses always do. Cold stone, tall windows, metal detectors humming near the entrance. I climbed the courthouse steps slowly, careful with my knees. Halfway up, I heard someone call my name. "Mom?" Anna hurried toward me holding 2 coffees and looking anxious already. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm breathing." "That's not an answer." I smiled faintly. "That's the only answer people our age can guarantee." She laughed despite herself. "That's the thing about daughters. Even grown daughters still need moments where their mothers sound steady." Anna glanced toward the entrance nervously. "They're already inside." Of course they were. People like Evelyn always arrive early when they think there's a public victory waiting for them. "Mom," Anna lowered her voice. "Last chance to settle. Number. You could lose everything." I looked at her carefully. "You know what your father used to hate most?" "What?" "Bullies." She nodded slowly. Frank hated arrogance in every form. Especially wealthy people who used influence like a weapon. Maybe that's why we understood each other so well. He came from privilege but never worshipped it. That quality skipped a generation with Evelyn. The moment we entered the courthouse lobby, I saw them. Evelyn stood near the security checkpoint wearing a cream-colored designer suit and pearls large enough to pay someone's mortgage. Richard stood beside her in a tailored charcoal suit, pretending to look solemn. And surrounding them, lawyers. 3 of them. All expensive. All polished. All carrying thick trial binders for a property dispute that should have been simple. Evelyn spotted me immediately. That smile returned. The one that never reached her eyes. Well, she said loudly enough for nearby people to hear, Margaret actually came. I kept walking calmly. One of the attorneys glanced at me briefly, clearly expecting legal counsel nearby. When he realized I was alone, his expression changed slightly. Predators recognize isolation. You don't have a lawyer, Richard asked. I didn't say that. Evelyn laughed softly. Oh, sweetheart, this isn't small claims court. Anna stiffened beside me. Grandma? It's fine, I said quietly. Evelyn stepped closer. The perfume hit first, sharp and expensive. You should have accepted the settlement, she said. I met her eyes evenly. And you should have respected your son's wishes. Something hardened in her expression immediately. There it is, she whispered. That arrogance. No, I said calmly. That's grief. For a moment, I almost saw discomfort flicker across her face. Almost. Then it vanished. You're finished, Evelyn said. I didn't answer. Because sometimes silence unsettles cruel people more than anger ever could. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. Old wooden benches. American flag near the judge's bench. The faint smell of dust and old paper. I sat alone at the defense table while Evelyn's legal team spread materials across theirs like they were preparing for a corporate merger. People stared. Not openly, but enough. An older woman sitting in the back actually gave me a sympathetic look. Probably assumed I couldn't afford representation. Honestly, part of me appreciated that. Underestimation creates opportunities. Anna squeezed my shoulder before sitting behind me. You sure you're okay? I nodded once. Truthfully, I felt calmer than I had in months. Courtrooms always made sense to me. Unlike family. Family fights are emotional. Legal fights are procedural. Procedures can be managed. Emotions are far more dangerous. The hearing began exactly at 9. The bailiff announced the judge. Everyone rose. Judge Harold Bennett entered carrying a thick case file beneath one arm. Late 60s. Former Navy Reserve. Sharp eyes. Disciplined posture. The moment I saw him, I recognized him immediately. Not personally. Professionally. We had crossed paths years ago during a military tribunal in Germany. Back when my hair was still dark and my knees didn't ache during rainstorms. He looked older now. So did I. For several seconds he scanned the courtroom casually. Then his eyes landed on me. And stopped. A strange silence followed. Small, but noticeable. I watched recognition settle across his face. Then surprise. Then respect. Evelyn's attorney stood first and launched immediately into performance. Your Honor, this is a tragic but unfortunately common case involving undue influence over a terminally ill man. I almost smiled. There it was. The narrative. Poor wealthy family manipulated by emotionally unstable widow. Classic. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes, carefully chosen language. Emotionally loaded phrasing. At one point he referred to me as financially dependent. That part irritated me slightly. Not enough to react, but enough to remember. Then came the implication that hurt most. That Mrs. Hayes isolated the deceased during the final stages of illness. Anna shifted angrily behind me. Because we both knew the truth. Frank asked for distance. Not from love. From noise. Cancer makes people tired. And Evelyn never stopped talking. The attorney continued confidently. By the time he finished, the courtroom practically expected me to burst into tears or beg for mercy. Instead, I simply organized my papers quietly. Judge Bennett finally looked toward me. Mrs. Hayes, he said, will you be representing yourself today? Yes, Your Honor. Evelyn smiled immediately. I could practically feel her satisfaction from across the room. The judge studied me another moment. Then something changed in his expression. Recognition deepened. And suddenly, he stood a little straighter. The room fell strangely still. Then Judge Bennett gave a small, respectful nod. Good morning, Colonel. Every sound disappeared. Completely. Evelyn's smile vanished instantly. Richard blinked. One of the attorneys physically lowered his pen. And behind me I heard Anna whisper, What? The judge continued calmly. It's been a long time. I nodded once. Yes, sir? Evelyn stared at me like the floor had opened beneath her chair. Colonel, she repeated weakly. For 20 years I had sat inside military courtrooms, where careers, reputations, and sometimes entire lives depended on precision. And suddenly, after months of being treated like a helpless widow, I watched realization begin spreading through that courtroom one face at a time. The opposing attorney cleared his throat awkwardly. Your Honor, I wasn't aware Mrs. Hayes had legal experience. Judge Bennett looked at him evenly. That would be an understatement. I folded my hands calmly atop the table. And for the first time since Frank died, I saw fear enter Evelyn Carter's eyes. Nobody in that courtroom moved for several seconds after Judge Bennett called me Colonel. You could almost hear people thinking. The court reporter stopped typing. One of Evelyn's attorneys adjusted his glasses nervously, and my mother-in-law, she looked offended. Not shocked at first. Offended. As if the world had somehow violated an agreement she never realized existed. Colonel, she repeated again. Judge Bennett looked mildly surprised by her confusion. Yes, he said calmly. Retired Colonel Margaret Hayes. The room became painfully quiet. I could feel Anna staring at the back of my head. I hadn't told her everything. Not because I wanted secrets between us. Because some chapters of life become too heavy to drag into peaceful years. After retirement, I made a choice. No uniforms. No stories. No explanations. I wanted to be Frank's wife. Later, I wanted to simply be his widow. Nothing more. Judge Bennett settled into his chair and opened the case file. I believe Colonel Hayes served in the Judge Advocate General's Corps for over 2 decades. One of the younger attorneys swallowed hard. The older attorney beside him suddenly looked much more cautious. Military legal circles are smaller than people think, especially among senior prosecutors. Evelyn stared at me like I'd committed some personal betrayal. You were a lawyer, she asked. I turned toward her slowly. Yes. Her mouth opened slightly. But you said you were retired. I am. No, she snapped, visibly rattled now. You said you worked for the government. I did. The judge cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Carter, please direct comments through counsel. Evelyn leaned back stiffly, but the damage had already started. For the first time since Frank died, she no longer looked certain. The opposing attorney stood again, though with noticeably less confidence now. Your Honor, he said carefully. While Mrs. Hayes's prior military background is certainly impressive, it remains irrelevant to the property dispute before the court. That part was true. My rank alone meant nothing here. But credibility matters everywhere, especially in court. Judge Bennett nodded slightly. Proceed. The attorney resumed, though his rhythm had changed. Before he spoke like a man presenting a guaranteed victory. Now he sounded like someone stepping carefully through a dark room. He attempted once again to frame me as emotionally manipulative during Frank's illness. But this time, I interrupted. Politely. Your Honor, may I respond directly? Judge Bennett nodded immediately. You may. I stood slowly. My joints protested a little. Age reminds you of itself in courtrooms, too. I looked toward the attorney calmly. You stated that I isolated my husband during his illness. Yes. Did you personally interview his oncology nurses? The attorney hesitated. Number. Did you review hospice visitation records? Number. Did you speak with Dr. Levin regarding my husband's treatment recommendations? Number. I nodded once. Then sat back down. That was all. Simple. Precise. But enough. Because suddenly the courtroom understood something Evelyn never had. I knew exactly how courtrooms worked. People think military prosecutors spend their careers yelling dramatically like television lawyers. The truth is much quieter. Much colder. The best prosecutors rarely raise their voices. They ask questions. Small ones, careful ones, questions that slowly remove places to hide. I learned that during my first overseas assignment in Germany back in the early 90s. I was 30 years old, terrified half the time, and constantly underestimated because I looked too soft-spoken to survive military court. One senior officer told me directly, "You don't look like a prosecutor." I answered, "Criminals usually prefer that." Frank laughed for 20 minutes when I told him later. God, I missed that laugh. As the hearing continued, Judge Bennett allowed preliminary evidence review. Evelyn's attorneys submitted financial statements, medical records, and witness declarations trying to suggest I manipulated Frank emotionally near the end of his life. I listened quietly. Then I opened my own folder. Thin. Organized. Precise. Just like always. The younger attorney across from me looked relieved seeing so few documents. That relief disappeared quickly. Your Honor, I said calmly, I'd like to submit Exhibit D. The bailiff carried copies forward. Judge Bennett reviewed the first page. Then the second. Then he removed his glasses slowly. Interesting. Very interesting. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. What is it? She whispered toward her lawyer. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the older attorney cleared his throat. Where exactly did you obtain this document? I looked directly at him. From my husband. The document was simple. A notarized estate protection letter signed 8 months before Frank's death. In it, Frank explicitly stated that the lake house belonged solely to me, and that any future attempts by family members to contest ownership were against his wishes. And then came the important part. Frank had specifically written, "I am making this statement voluntarily without coercion or influence." The attorney's face tightened. Evelyn looked stunned. "That's impossible," she whispered. "No," I said quietly, "it's inconvenient." Anna covered her mouth behind me. I hadn't shown her the document either. Not because I distrusted her. Because after decades in prosecution, I trusted timing more than emotion. The courtroom atmosphere shifted completely after that. Now people were looking at Evelyn differently. Not as a grieving mother protecting family property, but as a wealthy woman challenging a dying son's written wishes. Big difference. The older attorney requested a short recess. Judge Bennett granted 10 minutes. The moment everyone stood, Evelyn turned toward me furiously. "You hid this." I remained seated calmly. "You never asked. You manipulative little—" Mrs. Carter, Judge Bennett warned sharply from the bench. Evelyn stopped instantly. But her composure was cracking fast now. Richard approached carefully. "Margaret, maybe we should discuss settlement options." Interesting. An hour earlier they wanted war. Now they wanted discussion. I looked at him steadily. "Your brother already made his decision." Richard lowered his eyes. Because deep down, he knew that was true. During recess, Anna sat beside me, trembling slightly. "Mom." I looked at her. "You were really a colonel." I smiled faintly. "Retired. You prosecuted military crimes." "Yes. For 20 years. Almost." She stared at me in complete disbelief. "I don't even know who you are." That one hurt a little. I touched her hand gently. "You know exactly who I am." Her eyes watered immediately. I didn't know all this. I didn't want it to become my whole identity. That was the truth. After retirement, I wanted ordinary mornings. Ordinary holidays. Ordinary love. I was tired of courtrooms deciding people's futures. But life has strange ways of dragging us back toward old battlefields. When court resumed, the tension felt entirely different. Now Evelyn's attorneys looked cautious. Careful. Defensive. Judge Bennett reviewed additional filings silently before looking toward me again. "Colonel Hayes," he said evenly, "do you intend to continue representing yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor." The older attorney exhaled quietly across the room, probably realizing exactly how complicated his day had just become. Then Judge Bennett asked the question that truly changed everything. "Do you possess additional supporting evidence relevant to the estate dispute?" I paused briefly, then opened my folder once more. "Yes," I said calmly. "I do." Evelyn's face lost its remaining color, because suddenly she realized something terrifying. I hadn't come into that courtroom unprepared. I had come impatient. You learn a lot about people when fear enters the room. Some become quiet, some become angry, and some, like Evelyn Carter, become reckless. Court resumed after lunch, but the atmosphere had completely changed. That morning, Evelyn sat like a queen arriving for coronation. Now she looked like someone trying to stop a flood with bare hands. Her attorney no longer smiled. Richard kept loosening his tie. Even the courtroom spectators seemed more alert, now sensing the story had shifted beneath them. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses and reviewed the next exhibit list. "Colonel Hayes, he said you indicated you possess additional evidence regarding the estate dispute." "Yes, Your Honor." "Proceed." I stood carefully and walked toward the evidence table with my folder. The old hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my shoes. Funny, the things you notice when a room goes silent. I handed copies to the bailiff. "Exhibit F," I said calmly. The younger attorney scanned the pages first. I watched the exact moment his expression changed. That little tightening around the eyes, the silent realization that a case is beginning to collapse. "What is it?" Evelyn whispered sharply. He didn't answer immediately. Good lawyers never answer panicked clients too quickly. Finally, the older attorney leaned toward her. "It's correspondence from your son." Her face drained again. Frank had written dozens of letters during his illness. Most were personal, some practical, and a few were painfully honest. Judge Bennett read quietly for nearly a minute before looking up. "This appears to be an email exchange between the deceased and Mrs. Carter." "Yes, sir." The judge continued reading silently. Then he asked, "Mrs. Carter, did you pressure your son to alter his estate arrangements during chemotherapy treatments?" Evelyn straightened immediately. "Absolutely not." The lie came too quickly, too polished. I'd heard thousands like it before. People think lying sounds stronger when spoken confidently. Usually it just sounds rehearsed. The judge glanced toward me. "Colonel Hayes." I opened another document calmly. "Page 3, Your Honor." He flipped pages, then stopped. The courtroom grew still again. Because there it was, Frank's own words. Mom, if you bring up the lake house again, I will ask hospital staff to restrict visitation. Maggie has cared for me every single day while you keep talking about property. Anna covered her mouth behind me. Richard closed his eyes briefly. And Evelyn? She looked furious now. Not ashamed. Furious. That told me everything. I wish I could say revenge felt satisfying. Movies make it look that way. Big courtroom victories. Dramatic revelations. Villains collapsing dramatically under truth. But real life feels heavier. Especially at my age. Standing there reading my dead husband's private pain aloud. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Because none of this should have happened. Frank deserved peace before he died. Instead, he spent his final months protecting me from his own family. That truth hurt more than any insult Evelyn ever threw at me. The older attorney requested permission to speak privately with his client. Judge Bennett granted 5 minutes. The moment they stepped aside near the courtroom wall, Evelyn exploded in whispers. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. How was I supposed to know she kept everything? She tricked us. No, the attorney interrupted sharply enough for half the courtroom to hear. You failed to disclose relevant information. There it was. The fracture. Good attorneys hate surprises, and Evelyn clearly hadn't told them the full story. Richard rubbed his forehead anxiously. You said those emails were deleted. Evelyn snapped toward him. Well, apparently they weren't. The younger attorney looked genuinely uncomfortable now, probably realizing he'd tied his reputation to a client with selective honesty. Military court taught me something years ago. People rarely destroy themselves all at once. They unravel thread by thread. And usually, ego pulls the first string. Anna moved beside me during recess again. This time her eyes looked different. Not confused anymore. Proud. Dad protected you, she whispered. I nodded softly. He tried. You protected him too. That nearly broke me. Because nobody had said that out loud since Frank died. For months, Evelyn painted me as some manipulative burden hanging around her dying son. But caregiving changes people, especially older couples. After enough years together, love stops looking dramatic. It becomes practical, quiet. You memorize medication schedules. You learn how to lift someone gently when they're weak. You sit awake listening to breathing patterns in the dark. That was marriage near the end. Not romance. Duty. Sacred duty. And I would have carried it forever if I could have kept him alive. When proceedings resumed, Judge Bennett's tone became noticeably firmer. Mrs. Carter, he said, the court is becoming increasingly concerned regarding the validity of several claims made in this petition. Evelyn's attorney immediately stepped in. Your Honor, perhaps we should discuss possible mediation. No, Evelyn interrupted sharply. The attorney froze. Even I almost sighed. Pride makes intelligent people behave foolishly. Judge Bennett looked unimpressed. Mrs. Carter, I strongly advise listening to counsel. She manipulated my son. I remained calm. Your son begged you to stop. That landed harder than yelling ever could. Evelyn stared at me with open hatred now. You think you're better than us because of your military title. No, I answered quietly. I think your son deserved dignity while dying. Silence. Pure silence. Even the courtroom clerk stopped moving papers. Evelyn's eyes watered suddenly. Not from grief. From humiliation. For the first time in her life, someone was forcing her to face consequences publicly. And she didn't know how to survive it. Then came the final fracture. I opened the last section of my folder. Your Honor, I said I'd also like to submit audio documentation relevant to coercion attempts regarding estate modification. The older attorney physically closed his eyes. He already knew. This was getting worse. Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow slightly. Audio documentation. Yes, sir. Evelyn looked confused, then terrified, because suddenly she remembered. The phone calls. Months earlier, during Frank's illness, Evelyn called, constantly demanding updates, pressuring him about property, accusing me of controlling access to him. Frank eventually asked me to record calls. Not for revenge, for protection. The bailiff connected the recording device quietly, and then Evelyn's voice filled the courtroom. Cold, sharp, unmistakable. If Margaret really loved you, she'd put the lake house back in the Carter family before you die. Anna gasped softly behind me. Richard stared at the floor. The recording continued. You're sick, Frank. You're not thinking clearly anymore. Then Frank's exhausted voice answered weakly. Mom, stop. That one sentence changed the entire room. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just tired. The sound of a dying man begging for peace. Judge Bennett stopped the recording after a few more seconds. Nobody spoke. Evelyn sat frozen. For the first time all day, she looked old. Not powerful. Not elegant. Just old. The judge removed his glasses slowly. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "this court now has serious concerns regarding potential fraudulent conduct and coercive interference involving estate matters." The older attorney whispered something urgent to Evelyn. "Probably settlement again." But Evelyn stared at me instead, like she still couldn't understand how the quiet widow she mocked had become the most dangerous person in the courtroom. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly. "If further evidence supports these findings, criminal fraud exposure may become a consideration." And just like that, the Carter family empire began collapsing in public. By the fourth day of hearings, the entire tone of the case had changed. When this started, people treated me like a grieving widow trying to hold on to something she couldn't afford to keep. Now the courthouse staff greeted me respectfully each morning. The bailiff held doors open for Anna. And Evelyn Carter, well, she stopped making eye contact with people. Funny how quickly power shifts once truth enters the room. Outside the courthouse, I noticed reporters gathering near the steps. Nothing national, just local Norfolk media. Small-town legal drama involving an old military family and allegations of estate coercion. The kind of story retirees discuss over coffee at diners. I hated attention. Always had. Military service cured me of any desire to be publicly admired. Because once you've watched young soldiers receive folded flags instead of retirement parties, recognition starts feeling very small. Still, I understood what was happening. The Carter name carried influence in Virginia social circles, and wealthy families falling apart in court tends to attract curiosity, especially when the helpless widow turns out to be a retired military prosecutor. That morning, Anna walked beside me toward the courtroom carrying my folder. "I still can't believe you never told me all this," she said softly. "I told you enough. You told me you worked in legal affairs." I smiled faintly. That technically wasn't a lie. She laughed under her breath, then her expression softened. "Dad knew everything." "Yes. And he was okay keeping it private. He preferred it private." Frank used to joke that my military career scared his golf buddies, especially after they'd had too much bourbon at cookouts and started arguing politics. Once years ago, one of them asked what kind of law I practiced. Frank answered calmly, "The kind where people go to prison." The poor man nearly dropped his hamburger. Even now, remembering that made me smile. Anna glanced at me carefully. "You miss him a lot today." "Yes. Some days grief sits quietly beside you. Other days it walks directly behind your ribs." Courtrooms seem to wake it up. Because Frank should have been growing old with me instead of becoming evidence in a legal dispute. Inside the courtroom, Evelyn looked diminished. That was the only word for it. Smaller. Not physically. Spiritually. Her expensive suit still fit perfectly. Her pearls still gleamed. But confidence had abandoned her. Richard looked exhausted, too. Apparently cracks were spreading through the family beyond the courtroom now. Money does that. Once inheritance fights begin, old resentments crawl out of places people kept hidden for decades. Judge Bennett entered promptly at 9. Everyone stood. The proceedings began with settlement discussions requested once again by Evelyn's attorneys. This time their tone sounded urgent. "Your Honor." The older attorney began carefully. "My client wishes to explore resolution options regarding the lake property." Judge Bennett looked toward me. "Colonel Hayes." I stood calmly. "No, Your Honor." Evelyn turned sharply toward me. "What do you mean, no?" I looked at her steadily. "I mean, your son already resolved this matter before he died." Her face hardened immediately. "There's still room for compromise." "No," I said quietly, "there isn't. Because this was never about money anymore." "Not really. It was about truth. And after months of being painted as some manipulative opportunist, I needed the truth spoken clearly in public, not hidden behind settlements and private agreements. Older people understand that better than younger ones sometimes. When you reach a certain age, reputation becomes part of your legacy. And Evelyn tried to destroy mine after I buried my husband. The hearing continued with final testimony requests. Evelyn's attorneys avoided aggressive tactics now. Too dangerous. Instead, they attempted sympathy. They framed Evelyn as a grieving mother emotionally overwhelmed after losing her son. Part of that was probably true. Grief twists people in ugly directions sometimes. But grief does not excuse cruelty. Judge Bennett finally looked toward me. "Colonel Hayes, would you like to make a final statement before the court rules?" I stood slowly. The courtroom became very quiet. I looked first at the judge, then briefly toward Evelyn, then at the polished wooden floor between us. And suddenly I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. Tired. Sad. Disappointed, but not angry. My husband spent the final year of his life in pain, I began softly. The room stayed silent. Cancer strips dignity away piece by piece. People who haven't witnessed it closely don't understand that. Anna wiped tears quietly behind me. Frank lost weight, strength, sleep, independence. I paused carefully, but he never lost clarity. Evelyn looked downward now. He knew exactly what he wanted: peace, quiet, time at the lake. I glanced briefly toward her. And freedom from pressure. The older attorney shifted uncomfortably. I continued. The lake house was never about money to me. That part mattered deeply. Frank rebuilt that dock himself after Hurricane Isabel. He taught our grandson to fish there. He spread his father's ashes near those trees. I swallowed carefully. It was the last place my husband felt like himself. Complete silence. Even the reporters stopped writing. Then I said the thing I'd carried silently for months. I did not spend 32 years loving a man just to steal from him after he became weak. Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time since this began, she looked ashamed. Real shame. Not wounded pride. Something deeper. Judge Bennett thanked me quietly before reviewing final documents. The room waited. At my age, waiting feels different too. You become aware how much of life happens inside pauses. Hospital waiting rooms. Funeral homes. Phone calls after midnight. Courtrooms. Finally, Judge Bennett spoke. This court finds overwhelming evidence supporting the validity of the deceased's estate intentions. Evelyn's shoulders dropped slightly. The petition contesting ownership of the lake property is denied in full. Anna burst into tears softly behind me. Richard stared blankly ahead. Judge Bennett continued firmly. Furthermore, the court finds credible evidence of coercive conduct toward the deceased during periods of medical vulnerability. Evelyn looked physically ill now. The judge paused. While this court will not pursue immediate criminal referral at this stage, let me be absolutely clear. His voice sharpened. What occurred here was deeply inappropriate. Nobody moved. Then came the final line. The property remains solely under ownership of Colonel Margaret Hayes. Just like that, it was over. Outside the courtroom, reporters immediately approached. I ignored them. Anna hugged me tightly near the courthouse steps while crying against my shoulder. You won, she whispered. No, I said softly. Your father won. Across the plaza, Evelyn stood alone near the curb while her attorneys walked toward separate cars. No family gathered around her. No comforting friends. Just silence. For a moment, I almost kept walking. Then I saw her hands trembling. And despite everything, I walked over. She looked startled when I stopped beside her. Margaret. Her voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. You could still report me. Yes, you'd win. Probably. She stared down at the sidewalk, then quietly asked the question I never expected. Why are you showing me mercy? I looked toward the cloudy Virginia sky for a long moment before answering. Because after decades prosecuting broken people, I understood something Evelyn never had. Punishment changes behavior, but mercy reveals character. You already lost the only thing that mattered, I said quietly. Then I walked away. 3 months after the court ruling, the lake house finally felt quiet again, not empty. There's a difference. Empty feels abandoned. Quiet feels healed. I stood on the dock one October morning holding a cup of coffee while fog drifted across Smith Mountain Lake in slow silver waves. The air smelled like pine trees and cold water. Frank loved mornings like that. Said the lake looked honest before sunrise. No boats. No noise. No performances. Just stillness. At 62, I'd started appreciating stillness more than victory. The courtroom battle was over, but something surprising happened afterward. People began treating me differently. Neighbors who barely waved before suddenly wanted conversations. Former Carter family friends sent awkward apology letters. Even strangers at the grocery store recognized me occasionally from newspaper photos. Colonel Hayes. Funny how quickly titles change people's behavior. Honestly, I disliked most of it. Because I hadn't become stronger after the trial. I had simply stopped hiding. Anna visited almost every weekend now with my 2 grandchildren. The trial changed something between us. For years, she saw me only as mom. Reliable. Quiet. Predictable. Now she looked at me with curiosity, too. One Saturday afternoon, we sat on the porch wrapping early Christmas decorations, while the kids played near the shoreline. You know, Anna said carefully, I think I understand now. Understand what? Why you stayed so calm all those years. I smiled faintly. I wasn't always calm. You looked calm. That's different. Military courtrooms teach discipline, not fearlessness. The public imagines military prosecutors as tough people who never shake. Truth is, most of us shook privately. Especially after difficult cases. I still remember nights overseas when I sat alone in temporary housing, unable to sleep after sentencing hearings involving young soldiers barely older than children. Some guilty, some broken, some both. People over 60 understand this better than younger folks. Life becomes less black and white as you age. You stop dividing humanity into heroes and villains. Mostly you find wounded people making poor decisions while carrying pain they never learned how to manage. Even Evelyn. Especially Evelyn. About a month after the trial, she called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. Part of me still wanted distance. But age teaches another lesson too. Unfinished bitterness weighs more heavily than conversation. Her voice sounded fragile on the phone. Not dramatic. Not manipulative. Just tired. Margaret, she said softly, could we talk? I agreed to meet at a small diner halfway between Norfolk and the lake. The kind older Americans know well. Brown coffee mugs. Pancake specials, waitresses who call everyone honey. Evelyn arrived 10 minutes late wearing a simple gray coat instead of her usual designer outfits. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked ordinary, and somehow that made her seem older. We sat across from each other quietly while rain tapped against the windows. Finally, she spoke. I was angry at Frank for years. I said nothing. He chose you over this family every time. There it was. Not greed. Not really. Fear. Fear disguised as control. Older parents sometimes struggle when their children build lives beyond them. Some handle it gracefully, some don't. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. When he got sick, her voice cracked slightly. I think I panicked. I watched her carefully. I thought if I controlled the estate, controlled the property. She looked down. Maybe I wouldn't lose him completely. For the first time, I saw the grieving mother beneath the arrogance. Not excusing what she did. Just understanding it. And understanding matters. It doesn't erase harm, but it softens hatred. I loved him too, I said quietly. Tears filled her eyes immediately. I know that now. That sentence carried more weight than any courtroom ruling. Winter came slowly that year. I spent more time at the lake house restoring old things Frank never finished. Fixing loose railings. Repainting shutters. Organizing the garage he always promised to clean next weekend. Funny how grief lives inside ordinary objects. A fishing hat. Old boots. Half-used tools. Love leaves fingerprints everywhere. One afternoon, my grandson Caleb found an old military photo tucked inside a drawer. Grandma, he asked excitedly, is this really you? I looked over. The photograph showed me at 38 in full dress uniform beside a courtroom podium overseas. Sharp posture. Dark hair. Eyes that had already seen too much. Yes, I answered softly. You look scary. I laughed harder than I had in months. Well, sometimes that helped. Mom says you were a colonel. I was. Like in the movies? No, I said immediately. Nothing like the movies. That's another thing age teaches you. Real strength usually looks quieter than television. Real courage often appears tired. And real integrity rarely announces itself loudly. A few weeks before Christmas, Judge Bennett mailed me a handwritten note. Short. Simple. He congratulated me on preserving both my husband's wishes and my own dignity during the proceedings. Then he wrote something that stayed with me. Some people spend their whole lives chasing authority. Very few learn when to carry it quietly. I read that sentence 3 times, because that had really been my journey all along. Not hiding weakness, hiding exhaustion. After military service, after difficult prosecutions, after burying Frank, I didn't want authority anymore. I wanted peace. But life reminded me that peace without self-respect eventually becomes surrender. And there's a difference. A very important difference. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Anna and the kids stayed overnight at the lake house while snow dusted lightly across the dock. After dinner, Caleb sat beside me near the fireplace holding that old military photograph again. Grandma. Yes. Were you really important? Children ask dangerous questions because they expect honest answers. I thought carefully before speaking. Then I smiled softly. I was useful. He considered that seriously. Then nodded like it made perfect sense. Maybe it did. At my age, being useful feels far more meaningful than being important. Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I stepped outside onto the porch alone. The lake reflected moonlight in long silver streaks. Cold air filled my lungs. And for the first time since Frank died, the silence no longer hurt. It comforted. I realized then that the courtroom battle had never truly been about revenge. It was about memory, about protecting love from being rewritten by bitterness. And maybe that's something worth remembering as we grow older. People may underestimate quiet souls. They may mistake kindness for weakness. But dignity has a strange way of revealing itself eventually, usually when it matters most. And if this story meant something to you tonight, maybe share it with someone who's ever been underestimated too. Maybe leave a comment about a quiet person who turned out stronger than anyone expected. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, justice, and second chances later in life, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one.